All right, so I think our speaker today is someone that really needs not much introduction, and that's because of what he has done, the contribution he has made in the area of digital platforms. I consider him someone that has highly influenced my thinking about digital platforms. It's really hard for me to teach a class on digital platforms without making reference to him. It is my honor, it is a pleasure to have you here, Professor Marshall Van Alstyne.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I think that's overgenerous, but thank you anyway.
All right, and this particular discussion is actually going to be co-facilitated with my colleague, Sabrina Schneider, who has taught digital platforms and is actually one of the scholars that has done some impressive work in this area. Sabrina?
Yes, nice to be here. Marshall, I look forward to our conversation.
All right.
You as well.
So what we've decided with Sabrina is we're going to make this a chat. So it's going to be a dialogue between the three of us. But we're also going to open up for questions. So if you've got a question, we encourage that you can type your questions directly into the chat. But you could also indicate by raising your hands, and then we'll moderate how we go about that. But ideally, it's going to be a flow and a chat with Marshall. What we've done is we've decided we're going to have 4 themes for this conversation. And if you look at the title, there are already 2 of the themes that comes out straight: the disruptive and empowering power of digital platforms. The way we've interpreted this is such that you can talk about digital platforms in terms of the good side, the dark side, and then we'll talk about it in terms of how it enables or fosters digital transformation. At the end, we want to end on a provocative note. So what do we do with all that we've been talking about? So to get us started, let's actually start with the good side, Marshall. And I have a question here to just ease us into the conversation. How do digital platforms empower people, organizations, or society?
Well, so platforms, let's be clear, first of all, what is a platform? So I want to make sure that we distinguish what that is, and then say what the good parts are and what the bad parts are. So personally, I like to define a platform as an open architecture with rules of governance to facilitate interactions. And all 3 of those components make a difference. The openness lets other people into the ecosystem so that they may come in attached and may add value. The governance is what motivates them to come in and add value. So you can open, a highway, but folks don't necessarily drive it unless they're motivated or to do so. Or if they're going to come in and make investments, you can't take away those rewards. You have to reward them for the upsides and the value of their investments. The interactions would actually create the value. So whether it's a ride, a tweet, a stay, an Amazon purchase, what have you, it's that interaction that actually is the value component of it. So most of the things that you've seen are huge increases in value. So platforms are really good, for one, at tapping spare resources. So think of the cars for Uber or the rooms for Amazon, or the small merchants that have a harder time reaching. A car might sit idle for most of the day. If you drive it to work, even pre-COVID, it might have been sitting idle for 22 hours a day, and then you get a platform to be able to increase the utilization rate of that asset. Or your guest bedroom, for example, your folks might have been visiting for 2 weeks max, and then it sits idle most of the rest of the time. So, or small merchants trying to be able to sell broadly, it wouldn't have been able to reach folks across the globe or have the same search capability except through Amazon, or setting up storefronts via Shopify. So one of them is tapping spare resources and tapping spare capacity, increasing value immensely. There's also so much data. They do a much, much better job of consummating matches. So your search makes my search better. My search may make Sabrina's searches better, or Sabrina's movie watching behavior might actually inform the recommendations that the rest of us get, unless she's watching very strange movies. I don't know.
I'm not sure if you want to see that.
The hope is that one person's interactions can then be used to make another person's interactions better. That is perhaps one of the underappreciated forms of network effect. That is, users are creating value for other users, whether intentionally or not. So intentional, of course, is user-generated content, or it's ratings and reviews. or it's just showing up for an Uber ride or putting content onto an Amazon store. But the unintentional ones, that's the artificial intelligence or the machine learning version, where you take an analysis of the patterns of one set of interactions and try to improve the other interactions. That is, you have more and better interactions. So new interactions will take place that didn't take place previously. That adds value. Or given a prior interaction, you can make it better. You can do a better match. You can make a better movie recommendation, a better product recommendation, what have you. So immense wealth is created by this more and better interactions and this tapping of spare capacity. So you get a huge value creation. And another piece of evidence of this, we'll come back to this in other ways, it's really quite interesting. If you look at the market capitalization of the major platforms compared to their asset base or compared to their employee base, it's fascinating that they have about an order of magnitude fewer employees per dollar of market cap. So if you compare in some modern and traditional industries, so Uber to BMW in transportation, if you compare Walt Disney to Facebook, Walt Disney makes some fantastic movies and you and I post the content for Facebook. Yet, Facebook has far fewer employers and it's way more valuable. So it's really interesting that we've created the value for Facebook and Disney is creating the movies, but Facebook is more valuable. So it's another explanation of how it is that these third parties cause the market cap to be so high, because these assets aren't on the books of the companies. So it's another way where you can see that there's growth, but the firms aren't necessarily directly responsible for it. They're indirectly responsible for these network effects that are causing the firms to be very large and very valuable. So that's so evidence of the value as well as suggestions of what the value might be.
Marshall, you just talked quite a bit about the immense wealth and the high valuation of platform businesses. Do you think that this valuation is something that will be sustainable? Will we see this in a decade from now still?
So that's a fair question. I've often heard another version of that same question is so what's next? Is there another business model after this one as another predictor? So I'm going to argue that there is some variation. We've just seen, for example, some drop in the market cap of Facebook. We can come back to some explanations for what that might be. But more broadly, I'm going to argue that these are absolutely going to be here 5-10 years from now in general. And the reason for that is I believe that this is a structural form of business model, analogous to the structural form of business model we saw a century ago. So put differently, I think what's happening is we see the rise of these gigantic firms in the internet era, analogous to these gigantic firms that we saw in the industrial era, but it's for the opposite reason. And it's a structural difference. So a century ago, whether it's oil or railroad or steel or electricity, all of these are gigantic supply side economies of scale. So massive fixed cost, low marginal cost. As you get scale, you kill a competition, you get volume, which lets you lower your prices, which kills the competition, which gives you more scale and gives you more volume. Those supply side economies of scale are never going away. We have the same thing here, but this is a demand economy of scale. All of these are driven by network effects. So it's users creating value for other users, or a product or service that gets more valuable as more people use it, right? That's the classic definition. But if it's the case that users are creating value, which attracts users, which creates value, which attracts users, that kind of business model is going to be with us now indefinitely. Now, there will be variations in it. It's also the case that they can unravel quickly, much more quickly than supply side economies of scale. So, once you've incurred the fixed costs for oil, steel, or railroads, you don't need to incur them again. You've got the railroad track or you've got the generator. Here, if you get some harm to the reputation, you might actually get users fleeing, as we've seen recently with Facebook. But in general, I think it's a structural change. And so I think this structural change will be with us indefinitely. Now, whether firms manage them well or badly is a different question. But I do think the fact that it being a structural change means that we are going to see this for a really long time. And it's not just a drop in the bucket or like the Matrix organization a while ago that changed to something else. I think network organizations, platform business models are here to stay.
Here's my take, and this is kind of building off what you've said. Users create value. So we're still talking about the empowering power of digital platforms. And one of the things you've talked about has been the fact that users create value for more users. And I think that can be empowering. As a user of some platforms, I actually feel so empowered to do certain things that I would not have been able to do without the existence of this platform. So that's one point. They also talked about it from the perspective of the companies. So companies that have been able to leverage or set up digital platforms, they just valuation is just miles ahead of the others that are in the traditional business. So I also see a lot of empowerment there. The question, though, then lies in the society. I've been thinking about that. So how do you think digital platforms are empowering to the society?
Oh, well, let's do two quick things. One of them is that not every platform is valuable. As a matter of fact, the failure rates on attempted platforms are really high. So it's the successes that are really valuable, partly because they tend to be monopolize markets. So once they've won, in the same way the supply side tend to monopolize, so that not all of them have high valuations. Everyone that tries a platform doesn't necessarily win. But it is the case that the platforms will help you connect. They will also, the good ones will also help give you tools to help you do what they want you to do. Facebook makes it easy for you to want to post. Etsy tries to give you support for other things. Airbnb tries to give you support for creating experiences when folks come in and rent your home. Uber helps you buy a car. To put it differently, the production function, in my view, has effectively shifted from the inside the firm to outside the firm. It used to be done that the production function was handled by employees. Now, the production function is often handled by the users of the external community, so that this value creation is outside. There's another reason I tend to call platforms inverted firms, meaning that a lot of the value is being created outside rather than being created inside. So of course it makes sense that the platforms give you tools to help you produce. So they want you to create value on behalf of others that they can then tap. So they'll take a royalty on whatever your exchange is, and they want to help you create that value. So they're motivated to support you in the production of value in some way. This could bring us to some of the downsides, because often they may try to take too much of that value as opposed to sharing it back with you. And this goes back to the governance. Is governance fair and just, or is it not fair and just? So it is not surprising they provide these tools, but they do so in order that you can produce value to create the interactions that they can then tap.
All right. So actually, I find that interesting because I was speaking with someone at MIT, and the way the person kind of characterized platforms, I found that interesting. Because when you think about a startup or a regular business, the key idea is, okay, if I create this value for these customers, how do I capture value back? How do I get paid back? But the logic driving platform seems to be that, well, let me create an environment where others can actually create value. So the emphasis is actually enabling others to create value first. Then you now figure out what are the governance mechanisms to capture value. I found that quite interesting. And one of the things I think I take away from what you've said there as how digital platforms can be empowering to the society, I would say you talked about employment, because it's no longer just employees of a company, but because value can be created by people outside the firm, you actually create some source of employment for people that probably would not have been working. So I think that could be arguably one way in which digital platforms actually empowers us as a society. But I do want to actually hear Sabrina's take, because she brought up the question about sustainability. So I wonder if platforms do or can actually contribute to sustainability. What's your take?
Okay, so I guess you're now talking about a different type of sustainability than my previous question, where I was asking about for how long will they be around? So thinking more about the ecological sustainability, I guess that's one of those two sides of the same coin. Right. Yes, one side, we do have the potential, and I've just experienced it myself living in a larger city in a great metropolitan area until last year, I was able to benefit from lots of sharing platforms. And there is this technological potential to do that. Now, having moved to a smaller city, this opportunity has disappeared. So now I see myself having to own resources again that I previously was able to share. So I think there is a lot of technical possibility, but still practically, we're not able to leverage this full potential. So that's one side of it. And probably the real other side of the coin is that also what many people experience is that more availability, greater affordability from a consumer perspective also leads to more consumption. So ecological sustainability, I'm not sure if we actually will have platforms as our solution. I doubt it.
I'm curious to hear what Marshall has to say to that.
So I'm going to politely disagree. I think that there are going to be a couple of differences where they can be helpful. So let me give you two reasons why I think this might be the case. One of them is the point that I tried to make earlier, which is that they tap spare capacity. If it's the case that you can utilize existing resources as distinct from producing new ones, you'll actually create less pollution. So you won't have to produce new items. You're increasing the utilization rate of existing items. So, to give you a simple example, if you could simply what's the phrase that they use? Reduce, reuse, recycle. Platforms can be really good at that reuse element of things. And if you think even of the secondary markets that eBay is around, you're selling your used items and others are repurposing them, and you're not producing those things. You're not showing up in landfills. So I think one of the ways it contributes is sustainability is that reuse function and getting more value out of the existing asset base. The second way where I think they can be helpful is, especially as we move toward renewable energy, that tends to be distributed as opposed to centralized. The centralized energy is the nuclear power plant or the coal-fired power plant or what have you, but decentralized is solar and wind attached to individual households. These are absolutely going to be platform business models because you're going to need ways for individual generators, almost exactly like individual suppliers of rides or rooms, individual generators in backyards or rooftops connecting to the grid and feeding power back. And then you're going to need to then manage the bidirectional flows of energy in there. So I think in the decentralized generation of power, I think platforms will also be helpful. So I think those are at least two ways that platforms will be useful in fostering sustainability.
Marshall, since many of us in the audience are innovation management scholars and practitioners, what's your view on platforms as an accelerator of innovation, in particular when it comes to all this orchestration of expertise outside of the company?
I think platforms are fundamental to new forms of innovation. I actually think they're fascinating. What's interesting partly is the extent to which not only do I think more innovation is happening, tend to be on top of the platform, but also the extent to which platforms appropriate a large part of that value on it. To give you simple illustrations, I think there are more than 2 million apps in the iTunes store and on the Google Play. Google and Apple didn't even conceive of the majority of those apps, let alone actually produce them. So there's a fair amount of experimentation that takes place. What happens in some ways, what Abiyama was talking about earlier, the platforms provide resources for folks to innovate, or rather to create. And then they want to create the marketplace where you then sell that innovation or transfer that innovation to somebody else. We do have another interesting question, the extent to which it's innovation in the small. So maybe it's innovation on an app or innovation in a service with Uber or Airbnb or a good that you're going to sell on top of Amazon, as opposed to innovation in the large. A whole new kind of product, a whole new kind of service that doesn't necessarily fit that area. So we do need to think about kind of incremental innovation, which this fosters, I think, extremely, versus radical innovation, which it may not necessarily foster. And in some ways, it might actually even depress, because there tend to be monopolistic practices. When there tend to be large markets controlled by one, or search, large markets for e-commerce, large markets for operating systems, you're not going to see a lot of competition. So I think we have to look at where we're focusing it. And it feels to me, honestly, as though we're getting quite a bit of innovation in the small, but perhaps a little less innovation in the large.
Interesting.
Avi, what's your view on this? Do you see a lot of platforms being used in innovation management in industry? Looking at many of those incumbent organizations that we collaborate with?
So I think the case of platforms is one of those things that's easier said than done. I mean, it's one of those things where you have winner takes it all, and that success story becomes the poster child. But less often we talk about I think Marshall actually alluded to that, a number of initiatives about trying to create digital platforms that just do not fly. And I think in as much as there's so much good that can be derived from a digital platform, getting to that point, I think it's something that I don't have the answers to. If anyone here should have the answer, I think it's Marshall, right?
So here's a further thought on just the innovation that's taking place. So you're doing a distinction between traditional firms and platform firms. So to the extent, so it doesn't necessarily affect traditional firms unless they can, for example, contract on Topcoder or Innocentive or others, so they can crowdsource their innovation practices to another platform. So that's another possibility. What's interesting from an innovation perspective, if you are a platform firm, if you think about, again, the distinction between your own employees doing the invention, so you might have a fairly steady rate of innovation, whatever value you're creating on your own group. But what you're getting with external partners is experimentation. And you're not incurring the costs of experimentation failure. And yet you're still taking a 30% royalty rate on all the experimentation successes. So it's a really interesting innovation model where you shed the costs of experimentation, but you capture the option on the upside. And that once you've got that, so Apple didn't invent Angry Birds, but my goodness, they profited from it. And you have a lot of those kinds of experiments that, again, you shed the cost of failure and you capture the benefits of the upside. So it's an interesting shift in the business model of how you conduct R&D. So they let others experiment on the long tail and give them a marketplace to do so, and then take a slice of the value that's created.
Right. I mean, so I think this kind of leads to one of the parts. In fact, perhaps this actually takes us to the second theme, the disruptive power of digital platform. So I keep wondering, because there are loads of things that we could say about digital platforms that are the positives, but I'm sure many of the people in the audience are also eager to also hear about, what are the things about digital platforms that we should be worried about? And let me give you an example. You made a case for the valuation of companies. And what you actually said is that these digital platform firms, they have higher valuation if you compare it in relation to the number of employees they have. And you talked about Walt Disney there compared with Facebook. We could talk about Marriott, the hotel chain, and Airbnb. So how disruptive actually are digital platforms? Let's start with that, then we can open up that example a bit more.
Well, I think they're quite disruptive. I mean, if you take a look example of, take BlackBerry as an example, RIM, even what's interesting, even among the platform firms, they're disrupted by other platform firms. Microsoft didn't move into mobile in time. They were too slow to do it. And so they've effectively gotten displaced by Google in the mobile space. They are below 1%. I think on Microsoft Mobile, Windows Mobile is all gone. I think they're extremely disruptive. It's also fascinating to me the extent to which the platforms themselves become harder to disrupt once they're entrenched. Why is that? I think there are two reasons. One of them is because experimentation is taking place on platform, they get to see these third-party experiments, and so they're not surprised by them. And as they move up the long tail toward the head of the distribution, they can acquire them. So they can observe. They have a market sensing function that traditional firms don't, because they are marketplace. The other one is that they tend to absorb large communities adjacent to themselves. So Microsoft moves into LinkedIn. Amazon buys Twitch in the gaming market. They tend to move into these large communities they see next door. I don't know how many of you know, but Facebook paid ISPs for data on emerging games and apps that were starting to take off and acquired them. This was one of their ways of observing the growth of large adjacent communities and then pulling them onto the platform. So they've been very good at observing experiments that are taking place and absorbing the adjacent market, or platform envelopment, if you will. And so they themselves have become hard to disrupt. Meanwhile, they're disrupting all kinds of industries. If you talk to law firms, Google is starting to process their documents. So, the lower level white collar labor on that is challenging. If you talk to automobile companies, Google is threatening them with the operating system for the car. I think I would probably bet on Google sooner than I would bet on BMW, Ford, Toyota, or GM for owning that operating system for the car. If you look at finance, they're moving into managing finance, and it'll be very interesting to see if they start to observe any of the cryptocurrency elements. If you look at healthcare, platforms are moving in there. Amazon is moving in, Tencent is moving in, Google is moving in. They're using the data in one industry to create value for adjacent interactions and disrupt those industries. So it's really fascinating modern version of a different kind of conglomerate, right? There was this idea of, good management, 20, 30 years ago. GE tried to buy all these different business units. Now they're shedding them on the premise that good management could then actually pull them together. Well, here it's actually the underlying link is the data, the extent to which you can take one set of interactions and make adjacent interactions better. Think about it. Amazon can analyze your groceries and maybe predict your health based on this, based on your, right? It's interesting how you can actually use the data in one. Google could take a look at your keystrokes and predict Parkinson's. It's fascinating what's going on in these platforms. And yes, they're very disruptive.
So should we be worried? I mean, isn't that so much power being invested in these digital platforms? Should we be worried?
Yes, I actually think we should. Here's where I think the parallels between the modern times and the earlier times are actually quite telling. If you look at the evolution of the industrial era, I mean, this is where we get the phrase the robber barons, in effect, because they were, folks in railroads and steel and oil. They sat astride these huge industries. They had these large cartels and trusts, and they appropriated the value. They depressed the wages of labor, and they appropriated most of the value for themselves. At the moment, I somewhat cattily remarked that we are all digital serfs in the fiefdoms of Page, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, and we don't get a vote in their kingdoms. And we need them. Now, laws adjusted to deal with that in the industrial era, and laws will adjust to do this in the internet era. We haven't reached that point yet. There are bills in Congress. There's the Digital Markets Act in the EU, Digital Services Act. China has been assiduously dismantling the governance of their platforms recently. It's quite interesting to watch what's happening over there. So we haven't seen all of that happen in the Western world yet, but we will. There's going to have to be more power sharing, if you will. I actually think we can, I have a couple of mechanisms we can propose to actually do that. But I think we need to reassert users' rights to, in effect, come up with a platform Magna Carta to take back some of the power, to take back some of the value. The issue is demand-side economies of scale and network effects, exactly like supply-side economies of scale, are natural monopolies. They tend to concentrate, and they won't tend to share the wealth unless they are, unless regulations rebalance the scale. And that's what I think we need to see happening. If you're interested, we can go into details of ways of making that happen, because I think there are some ways to make that work. But I do believe we do need to rebalance the scale so that more of the value you innovate and create is yours, as opposed to flowing to the center of the platform.
So Marshall, power sharing seems to be something that we don't have yet. So for the moment, I was wondering if power is with those companies, shouldn't every company strive to become a platform company as quickly as possible before we have those power sharing mechanisms in place? That's
a fair question. So the answer is yes, but with some certain caveats. So let me give you an insight as to how to think about this. So remember I said I called a platform an inverted firm. Why? Because more of the value is created outside than inside. So we must first ask the question, is it suitable to transform your business into a platform firm? The way to see that, the way to get the answer to that question is to ask, okay, how easily can I orchestrate third-party value creation? That is, how easily can I become an inverted firm, moving production value, the creation of value from inside to outside? Let me give you several tests that will make it clear when and why that might be easy. The first one is the most obvious. What's the proportion of value created by information as opposed to tangible goods? It's really easy to create network effects from information because, just as I was saying earlier, we can spread your movie watching data or your search behavior to make someone else's better. So the more the value proposition is from information, the easier it is to create an inverted firm or platform firm. The second one is how modular or fine-grained is the value proposition. So a ride, a tweet, a stay, an app is very modular, and someone else can produce it, someone else can certify its quality. Not true for a Boeing aircraft. Those are so complex, Boeing can't even get it right. Right? The MAX 737 is still on the ground in most of the cases. And just think about it, you wouldn't want to crowdsource an aircraft. You wouldn't want to be up in the air and the damn thing might fall apart. You need to own, if it's really complex and in need of high integration like an aircraft, then you need to own responsibility for that. So how modular and compact is the value proposition? A third one, and this one you appreciate because you're always interested in innovation, is how risky is experimentation? If experimentation is cheap, so Angry Birds, if it screws up or if it crashes, it's no big deal. Not true for a pacemaker or a nuclear power plant. If you open those up and third parties experiment, you can kill somebody. That's not safe. You have to own the safety protocols on that. So is experimentation safe for third-party value creation? And this is also how you get the innovation element of it. Another element is how much spare capacity is there? Can you create a marketplace in spare capacity? So good example, a $3 million MRI machine that is used 40% of the time. Well, if you can time slice it, you can sell windows of usage to small doctors' offices that can't afford them. And that, again, it increases the utilization rate. But what you've done is you've marketized that spare asset and created a marketplace on top of that. So those are all predictors of how easily you can create an inverted firm. That then gives you the question of, should you become one in the first place? After that, you need to ask two questions. The first is, do you control the customer relationship? Because that you need, if you're going to control the interactions, you need to be close to the customer. If you're not close to the customer, then you're going to have to go through somebody else to do that. And they're the ones that are likely to be the platform. The second is, do you have the critical mass? Do you have the resources to tip the critical mass to favor your marketplace? If you do, if you control a customer and you've got the critical mass to tip it, then by all means you should be running as fast as possible to become a platform. If the answer to those questions is no, then you might need to partner to become the platform, and then you're better off creating a federated platform of shared ownership, shared governance to do it. To give you a modest recent example, what we just talked about, I honestly think Toyota, Ford, GM are not big enough to own the operating system of the car. They're just not good enough at operating systems, and they don't have enough scale to do it. On the other hand, if Ford, Toyota, GM, and BMW were to partner and create a federated platform, then they could do it because they have enough control of the market that these parties they had previously treated as competitors, they could cooperate with and then own the operating system for the vehicle, and that would work. But I haven't seen them smart enough to do that, so I don't expect they're going to. The point being, if you don't have the resources to tip the market on your own, you may be able to do it with partners and tip it, and then federated platform. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Should you become a platform? And if so, how would you choose to do so?
Fantastic insights. Is there a new book coming?
So we are doing an update to the current book. So the current book is now 5 years old, and so we're doing another version of it. That's in process now. So yes, we're writing that up now.
I mean, because it was so well articulated, that could just be printed and just published the way you presented it.
We've got more writing. We've got more writing coming. We've got as well as some more research coming. So some other things that are coming out.
Right. All right. So I'd like to open the conversation to the audience, so we can also get input from people listening in. I can see we already have a comment here from Win Van Rebecca that can Marshall talk about in situ rights, if possible, applied to healthcare? Oh,
well, I'm impressed. Somebody's been reading up on the recent work. Okay, so what is an in situ right? So basically what we're trying to do is, it's an idea of giving users more power over their data. The simple description of an in situ right, it literally means in location. And the idea is to bring the algorithm to the data as distinct from data portability, which is to take the data out and put it someplace else. Why would we want to do that? There are going to be a bunch of interesting reasons, and we'll come back to, I think this will be useful, I think, across a huge number of different industries. Usually the way that what has been proposed to empower users, to give them power over their data, was to give them data portability. And the metaphor was using number portability. There's a fundamental misunderstanding, though, because here the resource is non-rival, and it's better that multiple parties can use it to create value, as opposed to steel, oil, or electricity, where one person using it means it can't then be used for something else. So data can be. If you take a data portability, first thing that happens is you remove it from context. So if you take it away from Facebook, you take it from Amazon, you lose the context. Programmable Web tried to download their Facebook data, and you couldn't get your friend's post. Why? Because that's their data. So you couldn't get it. So it loses the context. Next thing is it gets stale. So it's not updated. The stuff in the platform is recent. Whereas the stuff, if you take it, then it's stale and it's no longer, and it obsolesces. A third thing is it's not actionable. Once you've taken it off platform, you can't use it to make a purchase or post to a friend or receive a benefit or anything else. It's off platform. Another thing is, suppose it's breached. Now you've got 2 or 3 different sources that could have been the leak, and you don't necessarily know which one to blame for this. Contrast this with an in situ data right. In in situ data right, we bring the algorithm to the data stays in the same place. So first of all, it keeps its context completely in location. So you keep all the context. It's completely actionable, so you can receive a benefit or you can make a purchase. It never gets stale. And also, if there's a data breach, you got one throat to choke in here, because you know actually where it had to leak from. And it's even better in terms of privacy, because imagine a third party that had used your data behaves badly. You can turn off the APIs and know that they don't have your data anymore. You don't have to put it in good faith if they destroyed it or not, because they never had it. You took the algorithm to the data rather than giving them the data in the first place. So it all stays in one the in situ data, right? Puts it in one location. If anyone's interested, we have a really short article on that. I can put that in the chat.
Please, I would actually appreciate you sending that. Please do include the link to the chat.
Now, this also goes to the power question earlier. So you're asking how we're going to change the power on that. Now this is really cool in my view, because it really completely changes the power dynamic on this. The first thing that happens, and it's exactly analogous to the data portability that was introduced in Europe. We're taking this a step further, giving users data rights. You as the user have total control over whichever third parties can send you their algorithms so that you can run them in location. Now, let's start with one simple example and elevate it to another higher level. With this, you could empower Facebook to recommend friends based on your Amazon reading, or you could empower Amazon to recommend books based on your friends and what they're reading in either direction. You can see how that would work. So you could actually have them go in and look, and you would give them permission to go in. It gets better. Once you have that power, Google could start to run ads on your Facebook account, or Facebook could start to run ads on your Google account. Now, what does this do? With your power, you're the one that gets to determine who does that. That means they're going to share more of that ad revenue with guess who? You. So this gives you more power over the use of your data. And what we've done is we've created competition on top. So this, in my view, will restore a lot of the, now you're saying who has access to that data on and off. You've got the key. It stays in the infrastructure and others can actually then give you that benefit. It also solves an oversight problem. You may have heard the story that there was a group of researchers at NYU that was trying to track misinformation in political ads. Facebook booted them off the platform, despite the fact they had permission from the users in order to do that tracking. Now, if you had the right to do that, then Facebook couldn't turn off those API access because you would have had the legal right. This provides oversight. The NYU team had determined that, yes, there was a lot of misinformation being presented. And interestingly enough, there were in the repository of ads that Facebook claimed that they were making available to researchers, there were over 100,000 ads missing. Now, with a tool like the one that they had developed, we can actually have oversight as to what they're really doing, and then move power back to the users. You can actually observe what they're showing you and give you the rights. You could even have a consumer reports dashboard, again, at your choosing, that would see what you're being presented with. So it restores a lot of that power. The European legislation suggested that they have monitors go in and check what the platform firms are doing. I don't think that's a clever solution. It's having the state intervene. And I also think they don't necessarily have the tools to go inside the organization and see what these machine learning algorithms are doing. It's very hard to explain. By contrast, if you had this Insitu data right, Google could keep an eye on Facebook, Facebook could keep an eye on Amazon, and they can report on each other's misbehavior. So you get oversight in here that I think is actually a huge win. So I think the Insitu data rights, I think, are going to be a huge win for users if we can get those in place. In healthcare, which was the person's original question, there's a huge long-winded answer to that. This, I think, is actually extremely valuable, especially in the United States, because we've long had the HIPAA requirements, the Health Information Privacy and Accountability Act, which makes it extremely hard to analyze data crossing different zones. And so you haven't been able to create network effects. If users had in situ data rights, they could empower folks or pharmaceutical companies or Google or whomever in exchange for value of some form to go in and see that data and then analyze it for human benefit. I think you then be able to create more value in the healthcare community. And it's one of the impediments to more platformization of the healthcare marketplace. So I think that we'd get more value and we'd get more network effects created. And we would get more services on top, again, with user control of the APIs on their data. So I think these in situ data rights would be a very powerful way of restoring the balance of power to users as well as providing oversight. And I think this will cross industries. I think it'll be healthcare. I think it'll be banking. I think it'll be retail, all kinds of different opportunities for that. So anyway, whoever asked that question, I'm impressed. I hadn't raised that, and that's only really recent stuff. So that we literally finished the first draft of that stuff a couple, a month or two ago.
Right. I think Wim is an editor, so he probably reads a lot of a lot of articles, I can imagine.
But I'll put a link to the article in the chat so that everyone can have it. It's really it's a simple description. It's readily available.
Right. So I really do find the Insitu point very, very fascinating. And there's a question actually in the chat as well, which right now for the audience, we're kind of moving from the disruptive, the dark side, to now talking about digital transformation, how you can transform your organizations. In fact, this is even bigger than the organization with the Insitu concept that Marshall introduced. But the question we have in the chat, which I'm going to tie to one of the questions I have in mind, the person, Mark, is actually asking about your opinion on more decentralized approach, as we see a lot of failure stories regarding centralized platform approaches, especially in B2B. And what I have seen companies trying to set up a digital platform, and the challenge they have is getting access to this data, right? Because they probably have the devices that connect to all these different clients, but getting the rights and the access to be able to pull all that together, that becomes an issue. So what's your take on that?
So help me understand the question. So it's decentralized approaches to platforms in B2B, or it is the case that B2B is harder to set up than B2C. The reason is, again, if you focus, the unit of analysis should always be the interaction. And what's interesting in B2B is that the value of an interaction tends to be enormous. So a single interaction could be millions of dollars. The volume doesn't tend to be as high. So it's harder to spread the value across interaction to interaction to interaction. So it's harder to create B2B platforms than it is B2C. Now, that's not to say that that's not impossible. And I also expect this is about to change as we move toward IoT, Internet of Things. The reason is we're going to be moving toward, get this, machine-to-machine interaction, and that could dwarf the person-to-person interaction in terms of volume. So I expect those are going to be immensely powerful platforms. So I do expect it's harder to do it, but I fully expect that that's going to happen. Especially in the IoT space where you get machine-to-machine interaction. So I guess it was Mark that asked that question. I don't know. Let me invite Mark to try to clarify or add additional detail to what he means by decentralized approaches in B2B. I don't know if this is also fintech and blockchain or other elements of what is meant.
Right. I think we can open it to Mark. Mark, can you unmute and perhaps explain your question?
Yeah, here I am. Thanks for the opportunity, and if I may. Well, while I'm thinking about somehow of a counter approach here, yeah, so platforms are very much centralized, yeah, and what industrial firms, especially in B2B, somehow feared of is about sharing data with others, because data are their competitive edge. And right now, there are initiatives, especially European initiatives, about thinking more decentralized. Let the data be where it is. Yeah, it's about data sovereignty. Yeah, and not about huge power asymmetries anymore. Yeah, and I would love to hear your opinion if the future lies with decentralization, especially in the field of IoT, or if it's rather a more centralized approach as it is with B2C, for example.
So there's a real subtlety here. So let me back up and challenge a little bit one of the assumptions, and then answer your question directly. So it is the case that data is often one of the principal sources of value, but it's also the case that data is often, just a cost element. So we want to distinguish. Firms are almost entirely happy to share data that are just cost structure like others versus key strategic data that they may not be willing to share. So you do want to distinguish between those, and often from a B2B perspective, if you want access to that data, you should offer differential pricing, in the sense that, okay, if you're not going to share your data, we're going to charge you more, we're going to charge you a higher royalty rate. But if you're willing to share your data, which of course is another form of value, then we'll charge you a lower royalty rate, or charge you less, because it's another form of value exchange. And then you let the partner decide based on the menu how much of the data they want to share. Now, back to your decentralization question. The key element here, and this is perhaps one of the most important concepts in all the platforms. Network effects are externalities. And you really, really, really have to understand the concept of externality if you're going to really understand how to manage and orchestrate a platform. What is an externality? It's a cost or benefit to a third party of any two-party interaction, okay? The simplest examples that we use at the very beginning which was, Sabrina's movie watching or search could help mine, okay, with something else. And that's what I'm not engaged in that interaction, but that's a third-party benefit. In general, that third-party spillover benefit, that externality, is too small to trade. What that means is you must have something that orchestrates that externality. That means centralized. Or it means at least some governance mechanism that intentionally and purposively harnesses externalities for purposes of sharing those externalities with others. Markets do not solve externality problems. There are three fundamental market failures in just unmoderated markets: information asymmetries, monopoly power, and externalities. You must understand externalities, and you have to internalize those in some ways. What does internalization mean? That means centralization. So that means you need a central organizing mechanism. If you're really interested in that, I recommend one article that we wrote on this. That's it's in Management Science, is Innovation, Openness, and Platform Control. And it actually shows why it's the case that a centralized mechanism is better than a decentralized mechanism in the context of externalities. So the single most important element in here is you really have to understand externalities and how you intentionally orchestrate those. And that requires some kind of governance mechanism, presumably centralized. The governance mechanism doesn't have to be centralized, but you have to have an organizing authority to internalize those externalities.
So Marshall, if I may just kind of add some thoughts to these. So I can actually relate to Mark's question from a perspective of one of the studies I'm looking at right now. Again, IoT, as you mentioned, is actually core to this company. This is a company that that creates manufacturing equipment and they sell to different clients. But these equipment have a software component that actually holds data. And this kind of creates a setup where they can actually have a platform, because there's so much data coming here, and they can inform the other participants when they can learn from what's happening. If there's a breakdown in this machine, then they can use that. So they can really create value that can benefit all the other people there. But the issue has been the access to this data. So these other B2B, again, I think you highlighted the issues of B2B, is they're not very willing to share their data. For them, is a strategic asset. Even if it's not a strategic asset, they just don't want to share the data. And that's where I thought your Insitu idea perhaps could actually play an important role here, where you move the algorithm to the data, and perhaps it's possible to then centralize what is learned based on the algorithm, and then use that to actually feed intelligence to all the other partners of that ecosystem. How does that sound to you?
So actually, Insitu should help with exactly that kind of issue, as individuals or companies or what have you then can keep their data where it is. And then third party, I actually really like your insight. I actually think it'd be entirely possible to move other business algorithms to your proprietary data, and then they can see what you're doing with it, and it reduces. The more I think about your proposal, that gives them the power to see what's happening with their data, as well as participate in the value that's created with their data.
Indeed.
So it should help to solve that problem of creating these exchanges, because they don't have to give it up. You use the power of bringing the algorithm to the data, and they don't have to give it up. So you got a great idea. You can have your own paper out of this. It's a cool idea.
Well, it came from the study, and are you inspired? But there's something I just want to go back to, and I think I'll address this to Sabrina, because you've talked a lot about movie watching. And one of these platforms that we have in the world right now that I think is in fact not just a platform, they've become an infrastructure. But it's almost you cannot do without infrastructure, and I'm talking about Google. Now, when you think about Google for a minute, they not only provide us with maps, they just provide us with value that's irresistible, right? It's hard to not even want to use Google's products. There's YouTube, there's the search function, there's the maps, there's Google Chrome. And the question about the power still comes back to mind. And I wonder, how do we reconcile this when a platform becomes so powerful and yet we seem to just live under the wings of what the platform decides? And somebody asked the question about metaverse as well. So maybe Sabrina, then we can hear from Marshall as well.
Well, I guess if you would have asked me this question maybe 5 years ago, I would have talked a lot about us building awareness for what we do and understanding what happens with our data. But I think now we're at the point where, at least for many of us, this transparency exists. So we are aware that we are engaged in exchange. We are offering some data and we do get something out of it. I think what we need to differentiate are those situations where we make it voluntarily. So I think it's still my choice to join Facebook, to share data on Facebook. But it's quite different when you bring up the example of Google. I would struggle to imagine a life without any search engines in the web. Or let me put it differently, where a world that has those search engines and only me not using it. So I think it's not up to the individual anymore to find a solution. So I think this is one of those situations where we do need this share of power and potentially also stronger, different types of regulations. And maybe Marshall, I'd like to pass this question on to you. What's your view on this? What can the individual do? And which other players might have a responsibility here as well, or should have?
So let me make sure I understand the question. What can the individual do to reclaim power or to... we've actually been working on a Magna Carta of citizens' data rights. And I actually think that there are, we actually have a draft of this. It's not public, but if folks are interested, I'm happy to circulate it. And we think we put forth about 7 different principles where I think individuals need to assert their rights, and typically this will be through their governments. The individuals as a unit of analysis are typically too small to assert power over the platform. Again, as I say, we don't get to vote in the the platforms of Page, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, but one of them are, for example, voting rights. I think we do need voting rights, and it would be nice if we did. In fact, we could simply use, I don't know if you know the work of Elinor Ostrom, but that was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, and she had a number of wonderful properties on how you should manage collective resources. Data is a great collective resource. So we could use Elinor Ostrom's properties for the governance of that data resource. And that's one, and we would need voting rights in that. You need tiered architectures for that. Others are due process. At the moment, again, this is why we call it kind of a platform Magna Carta. In 1215, King John of England got to make the laws, he got to judge the problems, and he got to execute folks that he didn't like. Page, Bezos, and Zuckerberg all do the same thing. They get to make the rules, they get to judge the rules, and they get to digitally execute the folks they don't like, right? I am no fan of Donald Trump, but it was fascinating that there was no due process in his digital execution on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook. We need, as a society, we need due process. I think, and that's something, again, that I think is going to need to be asserted at the government level as another element of that. Another one, free speech. At the moment, the platforms are effectively deciding that. And this is one where we as a society do need to make those decisions. And those won't be the same in every society. They differ now in France and Germany than the United States. They differ in Western societies versus Asian societies. Different societies will make different claims, but at the moment, the individuals can't make those assertions at all. So those are other things. And that's going to be one of the trickiest ones because, as an example, Tencent is policing content that the Chinese government doesn't like outside China. And that's not really legit. When 2 Americans share content that is then deleted on Tencent, that's not, then they're reaching across boundaries in ways that are they're denying rights that individuals already possess. So that's something that would need to be negotiated. So those are the kinds of things I think need to be asserted, but it's like, in this case, I think it's going to have to be asserted through the government. You know, if you're interested, we have a working paper on that that's not public, but if folks are interested, I can try to make a link to that available as well. And it's literally a platform Magna Carta of what we think citizens can and should do to help assert the rights that they have. They're just not present on platforms because, you know, I think we're at a point in time where, like the industrial era, the robber barons are making the rules about their own companies, and now the platform barons are making the rules about theirs.
So, but is this just a repeat of what we saw a century ago in the industrial era, or is there something particularly different?
So again, I think this is fascinating. So again, there's about a 30 to 40 year period when the industrial giants arose. And we're seeing almost the exact same thing here. It's like a 30 to 40 year period when the internet giants are rising. So we are seeing a parallel that is the case. And again, I think one is supply side economies of scale and the other is demand side economies of scale. But that highlights that it's for the opposite reason. One is on the cost side of the equation and the other is on the value side of the equation. In the cost structure, the supply side, you're moving the cost side down through volume. And on the demand side, for network effects, you're making the value proposition up through volume. This then has some really big implications for differences in management, differences in regulation, differences in user behavior. Differences in management, the biggest one is what we talked about at the very beginning, the managerial mind shift from producing with assets you own versus trying to produce with assets you don't own. You have to be a far better leader to motivate people you don't know to come and innovate on your behalf, right? So you have to be, you have to provide resources, you have to provide some rewards, you have to do other things in order to get third parties to create value on your behalf. That's a different governance model, that's a different set of incentives. One of the things that we argue is that everything we teach in a management school has to take on this external counterpart. So take employees or human resources. It's not just employees that you hire, it's now freelancers or contractors, others you need, developers that you need to reward. Take operations management. We used to teach just-in-time inventory as the pinnacle. Now I jokingly say it's not even mine inventory because you're selling other people's stuff. You have zero marginal costs of production. Uber incurs no costs on a ride. Airbnb incurs no cost on a room on that. So it's really different business model there. Take information technology. Information technology has moved kind of from back office systems to front, you know, where you manage the order and inventory. Then it was front office systems where you do custom resource management. And now I somewhat call it out of office as you're doing search engine optimization and you're orchestrating external communities. The biggest one is kind of, I find it fun and critical is strategy. The product model, you're creating barriers to entry because you don't want folks to fritter away your margins, either on supply side, buy side, what have you. It's the opposite under platforms. You want permissionless entry of production and consumption. Amazon wants as many merchants as possible. Uber wants the drivers, Google and Apple want the developers, as many as possible. So it's permissionless entry. That's on the management side. So again, for every internal process, we need now an external value creating process on the platform side. The regulators also need a new set of tools, and they're different than the tools from a century ago. In supply side economies of scale, all the assets were created with rival goods. Again, oil, steel, railroads, electricity, what have you. And so the natural way to solve the problem was to create competition so that different railroads could compete on the same tracks, different utility companies could compete on the resource, or you would allow natural monopolies and you would regulate them, either of those two things. The problem is that data is non-rival, and so you can't use those. And so many of the proposals, and even many of the ones in Europe, are to create competition, but inadvertently fragmenting the data. That's a terrible idea because you create smaller pools to spread the network effects. So you don't want to do that. You want to do something more like in situ data rights. You want more folks to have access to the data, not less. So what you want to do is you create competition at the governance layer, not by splitting the asset. The asset's the information, which then if you split it, you're creating competition, but you're spreading each one over fewer people. And guess what? The platforms are just going to re-emerge as one or the other gains some edge, and then more users are attracted, and they create value. And then what happens is each new person makes a choice between the smaller or the larger platform, and the one's creating more value at a higher place, so they join that one, so it gets even better. So that doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
So the regulators need a new set of tools to deal with information and data as an asset, which doesn't mean carving up the asset. It means carving up the governance with access to the asset, like the in situ data rights. So I think that's a different way of looking at the problem. So that we have, once you understand what's happening, you can redesign the management practices, or you can redesign the regulatory practices. So in a nutshell, yeah, we're seeing the rise of gigantic monopolies, but it's the opposite reason. It's on the value side, not the cost side, which has different implications for how we deal with them.
So I'm sure with that point, you actually addressed one of the questions in the chat. But I saw what you did there. You just had a dig on what we teach in business schools. And
I'm sorry, what?
No, you just had a dig on what we teach in business schools.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, but it's not that the old stuff doesn't matter. Just the supply side economies of scale will always matter. But we need the new stuff too, right? We need the.
But indeed.
Yeah. So if you only teach the old stuff, the kids aren't going to be prepared for dealing with the new stuff. So you have to have both.
Well, I was actually just going to ask Sabrina, so what are you teaching your students now? And this is the moment of truth.
The moment of truth. Well, honestly, I was paying very careful attention, Marshall, to what you just said about how you structure the programs. And I think that many of us are still kind of prisoners in the old world. We're still used to teaching mechanisms, models, looking at platforms from a very strategic perspective. And I think something that, at least in my teaching, is still missing, and it definitely deserves a space, is the changing role of the people in the platform world. So you just mentioned this shift in mindset, the increasing importance of leadership. And I think this is something that in the future, at least in my teaching in this field, will deserve a much larger space. Maybe, how about you?
I think it's a growth area. I absolutely think that's a growth area. I think there are huge opportunities to get that right. The community management. Another way to think about it is the companies often had product managers, and now, again, the stuff that's internally produced. Now you're going to have to go to community managers. It's externally focused as opposed to internally focused. So and you're going to have leadership, and you're also going to have better listening and sensing functions. Because again, these things can unravel if folks get really pissed at you and they leave. So if people leave, they stop creating value. So people leave, so they stop creating value. So it can unravel if we're not careful.
Right. So I think we're actually getting pretty close to wrapping up. And what you have done is you've actually given some comments, some implications and recommendations for regulators. You've also talked a bit about for organizations, and actually conversations Sabrina also took us to teachers. But there are still this group that would actually value hearing your thoughts. And that would be scholars, those that want to actually publish about these things. But there are also students, management students themselves. What would be your recommendations for how they should prepare themselves for a world where platforms become dominant? So if you could just share your thoughts on those two, and perhaps one more word for innovation managers, we'd really appreciate that.
So let me give you one more data point. It's actually a little bit of a tangent, but it's also direct on topic for your digital transformation. So so if you're going to go into the world, one of the things you can do is figure out how to do this. We did a study of, and it's an empirical study. It's econometric. It's on SSR, and this is up. So this has been, it's in the peer review process. So this is another one. It's a study of firms that adopted APIs, application programming interfaces, as part of digital transformation. And we compared 3 different sets of firms. So one is the firms that didn't adopt APIs at all. So in some sense, that's the control group. Then there's the set of firms that adopted APIs and used them internally. So you could use them to reconfigure your assets, to modularize them. And you can think of it as being able to reposition assets more quickly, or to swap out non-functional assets, or to add new assets more easily once you add APIs. And the third set were the folks that used APIs for external attachment, to allow third parties in to access their assets. Guess which group the most value? It was the third group. It was the third group that actually opened external value. So this would go directly to some of the things that Sabrina was interested in. It's easier to capture external, it's outside in innovation. Third parties can use your resources to create new stuff. There's also the outside in innovation. That is, you can tap third-party values to pull their resources in and create value with that. So the outside in and the inside out innovation were both possible with the APIs. To give you the numbers, those that implemented APIs for external attachment had market cap growth of 38% over 16 years. Those that used them for internal had some modest growth, but it wasn't very statistically significant. And those that didn't implement APIs lost market value in comparison to the firms that did. If you're going to if you're going to send folks out to do them, you can actually think of, and this is one, I think it's a really underappreciated technology, is APIs, is to use these as interfaces to package your resources and to access other resources, to modularize your systems in order that they can be reconfigured. Modularize your systems. If you think about it, the iTunes just did one thing. It only played music. So the original iPod. iPhone had all these different configurations. So it had MP3, it had video, it had geolocation, it had motion sensing, color screen. You can reconfigure those assets now into over more than 2 million apps. Part of your job as a manager or teacher is to teach folks to package their assets in ways that third parties can reuse them to create that innovation, to modularize them. So I think you get benefits of having third parties reuse your resources, and you can then tap other resources. That's also conditional on rewarding them for doing so. You have to give them rewards for having created things with your resources. If you try to capture all the value, they're not going to innovate on your behalf. In my view, that's what happened to IBM. They had a great technology. They tried to keep all the value of Watson for themselves, and they screwed it up. Folks didn't want to innovate on that one, and they now just sold it off. It was a huge, horrible mistake on their part. So think about external innovation. Think about inverted firms. Think about packaging your assets for reuse. And think about, for every single management practice that we teach now, whether it's HR or finance, operations management, think of what the parallel value creating mechanism and opportunity is outside, not just inside. And that'll help steer you in the right direction for creating the next generation of firm.
Right, Marshall, it has been an incredible time with you. Just as we would like to continue with these, I think we've come to a point where we'll have to call it a day, but it has been an insightful and field session with you, and we very, very much appreciate that.